Combat art has been around for as long as history can recall. Cave paintings, tapestries, and murals have all shown man in military encounters. By 1860, the camera had begun recording historical events. Civil War photographer Matthew Brady's work is probably the first major use of the new medium in military operations. As powerful as Brady's photos were, there was still room for the correspondent illustrator, personified by the young painter Winslow Homer, who later became one of America's premier marine and watercolor artists. During World War I, artists visited the various fronts, creating colorful yet emotionally dark images. One man who broke new ground was Henri Farre, who at 43 returned to his native France in 1914 to fight. He became an aerial observer and flew many combat missions. He also became the first aviation combat artist, recording his own experiences and those of his compatriots on 170 canvases. When a second conflict plunged the world into war again in 1939, artists on both sides quickly applied themselves to the effort of showing the people at home what was happening. America's entry into the war in 1941 presented a great opportunity for the graphic presentation of the conflict. Britain, Germany, Italy, and Japan also had their own programs, many examples of which survived the war. Some of the Axis paintings were collected by the United States Army and the new United States Air Force. A few can be seen on the walls of the Pentagon, especially German war art. Japanese art seems to have been hidden away. Reports of displays in museums in the country have apparently been without foundation. Fortunately, a few reproductions of Japanese art are part of American service collections. American combat artists had the entire world from which to choose subjects. Some specialized in one or two theaters or categories. It was easier to ride aboard a cruiser or destroyer or even a landing craft than in a combat airplane where seating was limited. Thus, many combat artists painted life on board ship or ashore, relying on interviews and media accounts of air combat for aerial action. Several artists tried their hand at showing surface ships under attack, defending themselves with walls of anti-aircraft fire. Most combat art shows aircraft on the ground, being serviced or perhaps returning from a mission. Artists also illustrated airmen, looking upon combat pilots dressed in flight suits and parachute harnesses, cloth-flying helmets and goggles perched nonchalantly on their heads or hanging from their hands, as modern-day Davids. Campaigns were noteworthy, but single aerial engagements were hard to authenticate due to wartime security. Thus, a difference between today's meticulously rendered reconstructions of aerial battles and the combat art of the 1940s is that while both artists show action, the earlier effort is usually on a wider scale. Modern work focuses on a portion of the same action. The Army's ambitious combat art program, officially part of the Corps of Engineers, ran up against congressional indifference after only 4 months. By mid-1943, 23 military and 19 civilian artists were serving on 12 fronts. When the program was dissolved, 17 artists were commissioned by Life magazine to continue their work at the publisher's expense. In the same spirit, Abbott Laboratories, a pharmaceutical company in Chicago, recruited 12 well-known American painters to tell the public the war's story through their paintings and drawings. Vice Admiral John F. McCain, then Deputy Chief of Naval Operations Air, described these artists' contributions in depicting naval aviation. They covered all phases of the program, from pre-flight school up to combat. There are pictures of pilots, enlisted men, and naval aviators, and of virtually all the Navy's planes. The oils, watercolors, drawings, and sketches provide a spirited chronicle of the Navy in the air. The Navy, however, wanted its own corps of artists, but did not want to run into trouble like the Army. Thus, records dealing with the formation of the Sea Service's Artist Brigade are sketchy at best. Griffith Bailey Cole of Baltimore, Maryland, is credited with starting the Navy's combat art program in 1941, just before Pearl Harbor, to show neutral America's defense of its sea lanes and aid to its struggling allies in Europe. Commissioned as a lieutenant commander, Cole sold the Navy on bringing in other talented artists as commissioned officers, along with a few enlisted members to form the Navy Combat Artist Corps. Eventually, 11 men toured the combat fronts throughout the world to paint the Navy in action. Often these men saw action alongside their more traditional warrior counterparts. The Marine Corps also had a small cadre of artists, but ruled that every man was first and foremost a Marine, and therefore had to graduate from boot camp. The tough training was hard on some of the older artists, but most made it through and were assigned as enlisted members of various units. Some managed to gain commissions by the end of the war. The Navy's Office of Public Relations administered the combat art program and the paintings and drawings produced by roving combat artists, allowing newspapers, magazines, and book publishers to present these eyewitness depictions of the Navy in action to the American public. Things did not always go smoothly, however. Lieutenant Junior Grade William F. Draper's first assignment was in the Aleutians, a scene of intense fighting between Japanese invaders and American defenders, and the only sustained combat action in the Western Hemisphere. Draper arrived to find that no one knew he was coming or what he would be doing. When he asked to see the base commander, he was refused. Undaunted, the young artist began painting what turned out to be one of the most sensitive areas in the camp, the command and control building. He was immediately apprehended by the base security police and taken to the commanding officer. During an inspection tour of the base, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, sat for his portrait. He became interested in the combat art program and asked Lieutenant Junior Grade Draper what he could do to help further its success. It was a golden opportunity. "I need to know when and where things are going to happen so that I can be there to paint them," Draper said. The Admiral thought for a moment and then took the artist aside to a secure area to lay out the entire Pacific island-hopping campaign for the astonished Draper. Eventually, Draper toured the Pacific, seeing action during the intense invasion of Tarawa, although he did not, thankfully, ride in with the first wave of Marines. Naval aviation was perhaps the area that was the most difficult to experience for the artists, especially in a combat theater. Besides the obvious danger, space was limited in a combat aircraft. Every crewman had to have a reason to be there. That is why many of the examples of artwork depicting aviation themes are somewhat benign, or shown in a narrative, third-person manner. The artist could not have been personally involved in the engagements he showed. A few exceptions were scenes of aircraft carrier flight decks and lighter-than-air crew. Although the war's art program ended by 1946, the Navy continued recalling artists to record specific events, as well as future conflicts. The other military services also keep a corps of artists on call, as seen by some of the fine work done in the Persian Gulf. Wartime art was not limited to the United States. Every combatant had some form of program, although few details are available for the Axis countries. Germany had a wide-ranging program, and a lot of Nazi paintings and drawings were captured by various Allied units. The Army and Air Force had a considerable number of German works brought to America and occasionally display the pieces, especially in the Pentagon. Adolf Hitler established the German war art program in 1941. A frustrated artist, Hitler probably fancied himself a patron, and after seeing paintings by soldiers, he decided to memorialize the achievements of his Wehrmacht. Although much of Hitler's combat artwork was used for propaganda purposes, there was much to commend it. Indeed, if it were not for the horrible political organization they represented, German combat artists might be seen in the same light as many of the Allied artists. Italy and Russia also had corps of artists, as did Japan. The United States Air Force accumulated a wealth of Japanese combat art, although there is very little information on the Empire's program. The Japanese sent photographers and correspondents to the various fronts, but no one seems to recall specific artists. However, there is no denying the large number of high-quality paintings and drawings that show the Emperor's soldiers and airmen at work. Britain, Australia, and New Zealand had many fine pre-war artists who went to work for the war effort. Today, Frank Wooten is probably the best known of these combat artists. He spent many long hours in the field, sketching and painting aircraft and flight crew of the Royal Air Force and associated Commonwealth forces. Muirhead Bone was an older artist who had also produced work during World War I. He was knighted in 1937 in honor of his lifelong achievements, which included establishing a long-term relationship with the Imperial War Museum and a fund that enabled the museum to purchase works of new artists. His son, Stephen, was also an active artist during World War II. Young Richard Urich presented himself to the War Artists Advisory Committee in June 1941, writing, "Now the epic subject I have been waiting for has taken place, the Dunkirk episode." This surely should be painted, and I am wondering if I would be considered for the job. The British withdrawal from Europe at the beaches of Dunkirk, France in May 1940 set the stage for the epic Battle of Britain. As Germany prepared to sweep across the English Channel and claim Britain as part of the Third Reich, Ulrich painted several striking canvases, some with unique vantage points and close-valued, vibrant colours. Another British artist was Leonard Roseman, whose impressionistic, graphic style showed everything from Londoners fighting fires during the 1941 Blitz to Royal Navy Corsairs on a carrier flight deck. As war clouds loomed on the horizon prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Navy's small fighter community was faced with making the transition from nimble biplanes to heavier, but faster all-metal monoplanes that would dominate air combat in World War II. Paramount to achieving success with the newly arriving Buffalo and Wildcat aircraft was the development of tactics to exploit their effectiveness. Worldwide aeronautical technology delivered several potent adversaries to Axis nations that Navy fighter pilots would have to face. Mitsubishi had produced the superb Zero fighter and Messerschmitt the 109 aircraft, both combat-proven by 1941 and flown by skilled pilots. The Zero had been introduced over the skies of China and virtually swept away all opposition. The greater speed of the late generation of monoplane fighters led to eventual adoption of two-ship formations as the basic building block. German-flown 109 aircraft fighting in the Spanish Civil War transitioned to the two-ship route and eventually brought the formation to the Battle of Britain, where it was also adopted by some of the British squadrons. Navy pilots pored over combat reports from the Battle of Britain, where the Royal Air Force was evolving combat tactics ranging from squadron-size attacks in line astern to line abreast tactics. Fighting II was officially designated to conduct trials with the two-ship formation. Formations also began to open in spacing to account for greater speed and turning radius. Tactics centered around mastery of aerial gunnery from various deflection angles. The standard section called for the leader, invariably the most experienced pilot, to lead the attack with the wingman providing cover. Compared to the 109 aircraft, the British Spitfire enjoyed superiority in turning performance over the Messerschmitt and developed tactics to exploit that fact. Over the Pacific, the situation was reversed, with the Zero having the better turn performance over Allied fighters. As World War II engulfed the globe, the Japanese Zero enjoyed a long period of virtual absolute superiority over Army Air Force's fighters in the early days in the Pacific Theater. A notable exception was the famed American volunteer group, popularly known as the Flying Tigers. Although not a part of the Army Air Forces, American Volunteer Group flew the same aircraft into combat and prevailed as the only notable success against the Japanese in the first 6 months of the war. The leader of the American Volunteer Group, Chennault, had been forced into retirement as a captain partially due to his advocacy of tactical thought, not in concert with the prevailing bomber mentality. Well before Pearl Harbor, Chennault was hired by the Chinese government as an aviation advisor to aid their resistance against the Japanese incursion onto their soil. He flew their fighters and played a primary role in assembling an air defense against the onslaught of the Japanese. He saw firsthand how the tremendous maneuverability of the Japanese fighters could not be countered by existing Western aircraft. He formulated the idea of dissimilar tactics coupled to an early warning network in order to deal with the overwhelming Japanese aerial presence. He saw vindication of his theories as his Flying Tigers ripped into the best of the Japanese attempts to annihilate his tiny fighter force. The Flying Tigers were repeatedly pitted against the 64th Sentai of the Japanese Army, equipped with the nimble Hayabusa that was similar to the Zero in size and performance. Chennault indoctrinated his group of pilots recruited from the ranks of the Navy, Army Air Forces, and Marine Corps. The idea of dissimilar air combat tactics was unorthodox, but Chennault made believers of his pilots. The tactics worked. Eventually, Chennault was able to compare performance of his aircraft against captured examples of his Japanese opponents. Chennault's solution reflected a land-based situation that allowed him to establish an extremely effective early warning net that gave him a significant advantage. Knowing where the Japanese formations were gave the American Volunteer Group the ability to husband its scarce fighter force and use it most effectively. Most importantly, it allowed the Flying Tigers enough time to climb to an altitude advantage that was significant tactically. Chennault preached a diving, hit-and-run attack that made the most of his aircraft's one significant performance advantage over the Zero, the dive. This was unorthodox for conventional fighter tactical thinking. Royal Air Force pilots stationed at Rangoon alongside the American volunteer group were threatened with court-martial if seen diving away from a fight. They stayed in close with their Hurricanes and Buffaloes and suffered far greater losses than the conventional and successful American volunteer group pilots using dissimilar tactics. Thousands of miles from the Flying Tigers, another tactics theoretician, Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thach, commanding officer of Fighting 3, was disturbed when he read the Fleet Air Tactical Unit Bulletin of 22 September 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor was only months away and, like Chennault, Thach reasoned that it was inevitable he would have to face Japanese pilots in combat. He was searching for any information on Japanese fighter pilots and their tactics and aircraft. The bulletin confirmed what initial reports coming out of China in late 1940 had said concerning the performance of the still mysterious Japanese Zero fighter. It was obvious that it was only a matter of time before his Wildcat aircraft would have to take on this clearly superior fighter. Since taking command, he had molded his squadron into crack shots and superior airmen. Yet, he realized that even if the Zero's performance was half as dramatic as the reports said, his Wildcat aircraft would be at a severe disadvantage no matter how good his pilots were. Conventional tactics would not be able to counter the speed, climb, and turning performance of the Zero. He set out to devise a tactic to counter the aerodynamic performance superiority of the Zero. Following each day of flying, he worked night after night on his kitchen table using matchsticks to simulate the opposing fighter formations, experimenting with various tactics to counter the Zero. He eventually devised a weaving tactic, but needed to move the idea from the kitchen table into the air. In order to properly test his theories in the air, he needed a dissimilar opponent that would simulate the relative differences of performance between the Wildcat and the Zero. As no aircraft in the United States had performance even close to the Zero, he came up with a simple innovation to achieve the desired result. As he later recalled in the Pacific War, remembered, "We had to practice this. But who is going to be the Zeros? How are we going to find airplanes of that sort, that fast and with that higher performance?" I told Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Butch O'Hare to take 4 aircraft and use full power. I would take 4 and put a little mark on the throttle quadrant, and never advance it more than halfway. That gave him at least a superior performance, maybe double, maybe not, but somewhat better. O'Hare was a recent addition to Fighting 3, but had rapidly proved himself to be a crack pilot, graduating to the shakedown team of experienced flyers who were charged with training fledgling pilots. His division put the weaving tactic to the test, but was frustrated by the coordinated defense of weaving Wildcats. Thach set out to refine the tactic and instruct the rest of Fighting 3. He named his tactic the beam defense maneuver. Deploying to the Pacific, Thach missed out on the Battle of the Coral Sea, sitting out the battle at Naval Air Station Chennault on the island of Oahu. His outfit, Fighting 3, had been stripped of pilots to augment other squadrons. He was now in the curious position of having a tactic, but with novice pilots that needed schooling in the basics of gunnery before they could advance to the Weave. The Battle of Midway lay ahead in the not-too-distant future. He was faced with the daunting task of taking brand-new ensigns into combat, with scant time to train them in aerial gunnery, let alone his new tactic. He conducted a rigorous training program out of the base at Chennault and was able to instruct at least some of the pilots he would lead at Midway in the Weave. Thach had the satisfaction of seeing his tactic work in the Battle of Midway. His improvised, in-house, dissimilar air combat had been crucial in validating his tactic and undoubtedly saved the lives of at least several junior pilots. It was a big edge for the Wildcat pilots. During Vietnam, Skyraider pilots used a version of the Thatch Weave in 1965 when they were jumped by a North Vietnamese Air Force MiG-17. They shot it down. Thach did not have to wait very long to test his tactic in combat. Fighting 3 flew from Yorktown escorting the dive and torpedo bombers against the cream of Japanese carrier aviation. The torpedo bombers became separated and were utterly decimated on their own by the defending Zeros. Thach's Wildcats were at 5,500 feet when they were attacked by 15 to 20 Zeros. The Zeros lined up and conducted sequential attacks on the slower Wildcats, making a firing run every 20 to 30 seconds. Thach was able to deploy into the Weave before the attacks began, and lost the number 4 Wildcat as he led his division into a hard right turn trying to spoil the attack. The Zero pulled up passing in front of Thach, who let loose with a snapshot as the Zero flashed past. It burst into flames. Now, Thach had 3 Wildcats left. His wingman was familiar with the Weave, but the remaining pilot was a new arrival from Fighting 42 and knew nothing about it. Even worse, his radio was out, so Thach led the 3 ships in a line astern formation, weaving to throw off the relentless attacks of the Zeros. He then directed his wingman to take an abeam position as if he were leading a section, and commence the weave. One of the Zeros, seeing an apparent breakup of the formation, made a pass on Ensign Dibbs and latched onto his tail. Dibbs radioed Thach, "Skipper, there is a Zero on my tail. Get him off." Dibbs made a hard port turn into Thach in accordance with the beam defense tactic, as Thach made a corresponding starboard turn towards Dibbs. They passed close aboard with the Zero still in hot pursuit, unaware of the trap lying ahead. Thach was now approaching the Zero ahead-on from the preferred position of being slightly below his target's flight path, giving him a favorable firing position. Thach commenced firing, and his 50 caliber slugs tore into the nose of the Zero, causing the engine to ignite into flames. The Zero flew away into the water. Thach and Dibbs continued to weave, forcing the Zeros to break off their attacks. Thach's new wingman, Ensign Macomber, flew wing on Thach, wondering what Dibbs was up to and becoming highly irritated at Dibbs for breaking formation. It was not until return to the carrier that he found out he had been part of the combat test of the Weave. The Zero pilots continued their relentless attacks, responding to the Weave only occasionally by aborting their passes when the Weave initiated. When a second Zero attempted to chase Dibbs through the turn, Thach raked its fuselage with 50 caliber fire, resulting in Thach's 3rd claim for the day. Thach's other section, escorting torpedo bombers, was also beset by Zeros and forced to fight defensively all the way to the Japanese fleet. Although unable to set up the Weave, they did manage to score 2 eliminations and 2 probables. Thach's tactic had proven itself in the face of the overwhelming odds. The word quickly spread, and other units adopted the tactic. In recognition of his role in devising it, the beam defense position was referred to as the Thach Weave. Although the ultimate solution was the fielding of the Corsair and the Hellcat aircraft, both aircraft were still in development and would not be available until the summer of 1943. Until then, the Wildcat would have to be the frontline fighter facing the Zero. The early carrier battles highlighted the need for a greater complement of fighters both to protect the carrier from Japanese aerial attack and escort Navy strikers. Carrier fighter complements were initially up to 27 and then 36 Wildcats to provide greater numbers to deal with the Zero. Thach was recognized for his achievement with the Distinguished Service Medal, a lofty award befitting his significant contribution which undoubtedly had saved many aircraft and would continue to do so. In late summer 1942, Marines went ashore at Guadalcanal, beginning an epic struggle for that island and the whole of the Solomon Islands chain. The Japanese vigorously resisted this intrusion into their territory by launching air attacks from their fortress at Rabaul. Marines flying Wildcats from the barebones Henderson Field on Guadalcanal also adopted the Thach Weave. The Japanese Zero pilots flying out of Rabaul were initially confounded by the tactic and the Wildcats' tactic of hit-and-run attacks. Tadashi Nakajima was Japan's leading ace and commander of the Leh-based Zero unit, recalled to Rabaul to deal with the Allied presence in the Solomons. One of his pilots was Saburo Sakai, whose score was already approaching 60 and was destined to be Japan's number 2 ace of the war and leading surviving ace. Both pilots were absolute masters of their aircraft and aerial combat. Sakai relates their reaction to the Thatch Weave when they encountered Guadalcanal Wildcats using it. For the first time, Nakajima encountered what was to become a famous double-team maneuver on the part of the enemy. 2 Wildcats jumped on the commander's plane. He had no trouble in getting on the tail of an enemy fighter, but never had a chance to fire before the Grumman's teammate roared at him from the side. Nakajima was raging when he got back to Rabaul. He had been forced to dive and run for safety. While Thach was validating his tactic at Midway and Chennault's shark-mouthed aircraft were decimating the Japanese, another significant event occurred. Concurrent with the attack on Midway, a Japanese task force attacked the Aleutian Islands. A Zero had been found virtually intact in 1942 on Akutan Island, part of the Aleutian Island chain. Its pilot had tried to make an emergency landing on a bog after suffering battle damage during the June 4, 1942, attack on Dutch harbour. He apparently mistook the soft bog for a hard surface and tried to land with the landing gear down. A patrol squadron, Catalina, spotted the Zero on July 10, 1942, lying on its back. An intensive salvage effort requiring 3 expeditions to the remote site was able to retrieve the Zero, and it eventually made its way to Naval Air Station, San Diego, California, where it was restored to flying condition. By late September, it was involved in a series of flight tests and comparisons against the latest United States fighters. Instead of using matchsticks or surrogates, an actual Zero was then available to develop tactics for each Allied aircraft. The Zero began to lose some of its mystique. Although still deadly, the advent of powerful new fighters like the Corsair and Hellcat gave Navy pilots some performance margin against the Zero with superior speed. After the testing establishment had finished its evaluation, some far-sighted and ambitious Navy fighter pilots succeeded in getting the Zero released for use in San Diego against fleet units. One of the pilots was Rear Admiral Bill Leonard, then a lieutenant who was fighter training officer with Commander Fleet Air, West Coast. His boss at the time was the famed James Flatley, who, along with Leonard, had fought the Zero in the early months of the war in Wildcat aircraft. They knew firsthand the Zero's phenomenal maneuverability. Both pilots also knew its weaknesses, and the best way to survive and win an engagement, allow pilots to train against the real thing. They argued convincingly to secure the Zero, the existence of which was still a closely held secret to use against fleet units in advanced stages of training just prior to deployment. Principally, the Zero was flown as an adversary aircraft against the Hellcat and Corsair to show the pilots how it smelled in the air. It was also made available to squadron commanding officers and senior pilots to fly themselves in order to acquaint them with the Zero's remarkable maneuverability. Reports were one thing, but there was nothing like seeing the real thing in living colour. Leonard had seen the Zero firsthand while flying a Wildcat during both the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway, and could attest to its maneuverability, especially at low speeds. Leonard flew the Zero primarily against air wings in their advanced stages of training just prior to deployment to the Pacific Combat Zone. He also demonstrated it against patrol squadrons. Unfortunately, the Zero was later lost in a taxiing accident when a helldiver did not see the small fighter and chewed it into scrap with its propeller. A more up-to-date Zero was subsequently found as the Pacific Offensive began capturing island real estate littered with abandoned aircraft during the island hopping campaign. This has remained the first documented example of the use of an adversary aircraft in a training role. The program was remarkably visionary, and it presaged much of what we do today. As Leonard demonstrated, the best way to be ready for an opponent is to be able to train against his aircraft, especially if the performance is radically different from your own. This is what the Wildcat pilots faced, and it is to their credit that they did as well as they did when they first encountered the Zero. Of course, in war or peacetime, it is not always possible to obtain flying examples of your potential opponents. The Zero based at North Island was only one airplane, not quite enough to train the multitude of fighter pilots under instruction during World War II. Lieutenant Boogie Hoffman was one the pilots assigned to do initial comparative testing of the salvaged Zero and returned to Pacific combat with Squadron 31, where he shared his experiences. No other formal dissimilar training existed, but there were opportunities for plenty of informal encounters. Back in the days of World War II, anything in the air was fair game. And if nothing could be found airborne, a pilot merely had to head for a neighbouring field, preferably belonging to a sister service, and beat it up until an adversary took up the challenge. If the skies around the local base were bare, then some units took active measures to ensure opponents would show. Commander Tom Blackburn, commanding officer of the fledgling Jolly Rogers Squadron 17, was working his squadron up in the isolated outer banks of North Carolina at Manteo, and when he deemed his pilots ready, he sent out the following dispatch to all the squadrons in the Hampton Roads area. Combat Air Patrol will be airborne over Manteo from 8 o'clock until 12 o'clock each weekday. Visitors welcome. Blackburn got the visitors he wanted in the form of fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and even some patrol types. He got what he wanted, commenting, "I have a vivid mental picture of a section of dive bombers pulling out of their attack on the treetops at 300+ knots with Corsairs, wingtips skyward, making 90-degree deflection attacks at their level. "We were busy. We never had more fun or better training." Blackburn's remarks are particularly on the mark on both counts. Although air combat can be very debilitating, the contest between two aircraft is considered by most to be fun, at least in training. An old adage goes, "If you are not having fun, you are doing something wrong." Of course, from a different perspective, a pitched battle at low level over a town does not conjure up fun. Blackburn's squadron had been previously based at Naval Air Station Norfolk, Virginia, right under the noses of numerous flag officers. When Ensign Ike Kepford had a dogfight with an Army Air Forces aircraft which descended below 500 feet over the citizenry of Norfolk, Blackburn got to have a one-way conversation with Vice Admiral Bellinger, Commander Air Force, Atlantic Fleet, about the antics of his hellions. Both parties were more than happy about the move to Manteo. Fun aside, this type of training is, as Blackburn suggests, good training. Beating up rival services' airfields and jumping their aircraft had a direct corollary with combat operations in the Pacific. The pilots flying out of Guadalcanal had to be ready to engage Zeros at any time. The landing pattern was not safe, nor was the takeoff roll. There is sound reason behind the Navy's carrier brake, in which aircraft maintain combat speeds until over the field, at which time the aircraft goes into a brake turn, minimizing the time at slow speeds before landing, in case a marauding Zero should happen to show. Throughout the vast aerial battlefields of World War II, the tactics that proved successful were those evolved from the dissimilar air combat arena, although the term dissimilar was still decades away from being institutionalized. Whether pilots realized it or not, the informal bouncing of friendly aircraft provided the dissimilar opponents needed to hone air-to-air combat skills. In every theater, opponents placed high priority on capture of opposing aircraft for exploitation and comparative tests from which dissimilar tactics were devised. Both Allied and Axis air forces developed specialized units to provide dissimilar air combat training after capturing sufficient examples of their opponent's aircraft. In the post-war stand-down, the utility of such units did not lead to formalized dissimilar air combat training, although informal bouncing remained as popular as ever. Following the campaign at Guadalcanal, the United States Navy was able to accomplish two important tasks that were vital to the defeat of the Japanese Navy. First, it reorganized the carrier air groups. The redundancy of having to separate squadrons flying the same aircraft type was not necessary, so carrier-based scouting squadrons were first redesignated as bombing squadrons and were then disestablished. Meanwhile, to solve the fighter shortage, the complement of fighter aircraft in the air groups was increased to 36 planes per squadron. Second, new types of aircraft and aircraft carriers were introduced to the fleet. The new carrier-based air superiority fighter, the Grumman Hellcat, began replacing the Wildcat, and deployment of the new Essex-class fleet carriers and Independence-class light carriers made up for the loss of the pre-war carriers, Lexington, Yorktown, Wasp and Hornet. With reorganized air groups, new carriers and improved aircraft, the United States Navy was prepared to begin an offensive that would eventually lead to the very heart of the Empire of Japan, Tokyo. Japan's initial objective of acquiring the southern resources area, the Netherlands, Indies and Malaya, was quickly achieved. The aggressive philosophy of imperial headquarters, bolstered by the succession of early victories, ordered a further advance. These additional gains overextended the Japanese capability of consolidating and strengthening the early conquests. This dissipation of resources, more than anything else, hastened the downfall of the Japanese Empire. Part of this further expansion was to take Port Moresby in southeastern New Guinea and move into the Solomons. After the planned Battle of Midway, further expansion south was to occupy New Caledonia, Fiji and Samoa, cutting the lifeline between the United States and Australia. The field headquarters for this push against the United States-Australia supply line was at Rabaul, located on the eastern end of New Britain, with an excellent deep water harbour. It was a prize whose capture dominated the Allied planning. However, in 1942, Rabaul was far too ambitious an objective, and one which could only be achieved by the gradual island-by-island approach. Because of the lack of carrier air support, each succeeding step had to be within the range of land-based fighter and light bomber aircraft. The terrain of the Solomon Islands is basically jungle and hills, extremely difficult to traverse, which tended to localize land combat and put a premium on air and sea power. Guadalcanal, New Georgia, and Bougainville had sizable harbors and airfield sites, which made them logical stopping points in a deliberate advance on Rabaul. Airfields established on Guadalcanal were of equal importance to the Allies in their northern advance. With a toehold firmly established on Guadalcanal, the slow, inexorable advance up the Solomon Island chain began towards the isolation of Rabaul. From the beginning of the war, the Japanese Mitsubishi Zero had been the nemesis of Allied airmen. Faster and more maneuverable than the Allied fighters, it had the drawback of light construction and lack of adequate armor protection for fuel, ammunition, and oxygen supplies. The best technique in the beginning was to make a diving pass through the enemy formation and not try to engage in a dogfight with the more nimble aircraft. When guns could be brought to bear, the Zero was usually severely damaged. As tactics were improved with such innovations as the Thatch Weave, the odds became better for the Allied aviators. Conceived in 1938, the Corsair was accepted by the Navy in 1941. This was the heaviest United States Navy fighter to date, built around the largest engine available. While its gull wing made possible a short and rugged landing gear to withstand the rigors of carrier operations, its problems in landing kept it from being accepted for carrier use. Desperate for an advanced fighter aircraft, the Navy assigned the early production aircraft to the Marine Corps to use from land bases. A field rework facility was established at Naval Air Station North Island, California, to incorporate a number of modifications to eliminate some of the problems and make the Corsair combat ready. Relief from tactical disadvantage came with the introduction of the Corsair to the Solomon skies by Marine Fighter Squadron 124 on 12 March 1943. Nicknamed Whistling Death by the Japanese because of the noise made by the air passing through the oil cooler and intercooler, the Corsair soon replaced the Wildcat in all fighter squadrons. As the pilots learned the superior capabilities of the Corsair and weaknesses of the Zero, the elimination ratio began to climb so that at the end of the war it was estimated to be 11-1. Besides its survivability in combat, the Corsair had much greater range than the Wildcat, which permitted fighter sweeps against Japanese airfields as far north as Kahili and Buin on the southern end of Bougainville. In November and December 1942, the Japanese built an airfield at Munda Point on New Georgia, the next large island north of Guadalcanal. This field was to bring their fighter aircraft within shorter striking range of the southern Solomons. While it was the Japanese hope for re-entry into Lower Solomons, it was the Allied hope for another step north towards Rabaul. The location, rather than any significant strategic advantage, made the Russell Islands the first objective after Guadalcanal was secure. When operational, the airfield at Banica moved Allied air some 60 miles closer to Rabaul. This applied pressure on the Japanese airfields on Rendova and Munda Point in the New Georgia Group, which came under attack in June. Weeks of bitter fighting culminated in the conquest of the New Georgia Group. This provided Commander, Aircraft Solomons with airfields at Munda, Segi Point and Baracoma, which advanced against Japanese-held positions in the northern Solomons. Interception of Japanese messages told of a visit by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto to Bougainville on 18 April 1943. Good as the Corsair was, it did not have the range to fly this mission, necessitating its being flown by United States Army Air Force aircraft. Flying low and skirting wide around the New Georgia chain to escape enemy radar, the formation arrived at the target site along with the Admiral's flight. Several quick passes and both Betty bombers were shot down and crashed in the jungle. The loss of the planner for the Pearl Harbor raid, Battle of Midway, and Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet was a telling blow to the spirit of the Solomon Island defenders and a portent of things to come. In order not to reveal the fact that some Japanese codes were being read, news of the victory could not be released. Also, flights of aircraft were sent to the area on subsequent days to make it appear to have been a chance encounter and not a planned execution. From the beginning of the war, Germany was seen as the major threat. The Allies made a decision to use the major portion of their assets in the victory over Germany and then turn their efforts against Japan. By mid-1943, there was a growing realization that the air and naval base at Rabaul might not have to be captured by force, but could be neutralized by aerial blockade as had been so effective against other bypassed strongpoints in the march north. The final decision to strangle Rabaul by air was made by the combined Chiefs of Staff at the Quebec Conference in August 1943, The decision was also made to open a second offense through the Central Pacific. The concept of Europe first meant that 2 campaigns would be fought in the Pacific with the troops and material available. Bougainville, the largest and last island of the Solomon chain, was invaded on November 1, 1943. By the first week of January, strikes against Rabaul were being mounted from the fields in the Empress Augusta Bay area. While the exploits of the fighter pilots received the bulk of the air publicity, it was the relentless day-to-day attacks of the bombing community that made the advances of the ground troops possible. Large-scale fighter sweeps, which had been developed during the neutralization of Kahili and Buin, were designed to eliminate the air strength at Rabaul and keep it from attacking the troops fighting on Bougainville. In addition to those sorties, large-scale dive bomber and torpedo bomber strikes were made against the enemy airfields and supply installations in the Rabaul area. The heavy losses of Japanese aircraft during the early stages of the Bougainville campaign included many carrier-based aircraft sent from Truk to bolster the Rabaul air defenses. The loss of these carrier aircraft and crew was later felt during the forthcoming battles in the Central Pacific. From the first days at Guadalcanal, night raiding aircraft had been a problem for which there was little relief except anti-aircraft guns and searchlights, with a few aircraft working with the lights. This problem had been recognized, and observers sent to England in 1941 to learn the equipment and tactics being used against night-raiding German aircraft. However, there were no suitable aircraft in the United States for this mission. 24 of the first Corsairs were modified into night fighters with the designation Night Fighter Corsair. These went to the Navy and had the normal 6 machine guns in the wing, in addition to the radar antenna on the right wing. Marine aviation had to be satisfied with the Lockheed aircraft equipped with airborne radar and 6 50 caliber machine guns in the nose. The teething problems of the Corsair applied to the night fighter Corsair as well, so that it was not until the Bougainville campaign that night fighter aircraft were used in combat. With the rudimentary equipment and the early stage of training in working with the ground control interception radar installations, the results were all that could be expected. In addition, there was a reluctance of ground commanders to shut off the searchlights and cease firing the anti-aircraft artillery guns. Night Fighting Squadron 75 shot down 4 enemy aircraft, while Marine Night Fighting Squadron 531, during a longer period, accounted for 12 in the months it was in combat. The Japanese quickly learned that it was not safe to risk their dwindling supply of aircraft in areas protected by the ground control interception, night fighter teams, just as they had learned not to risk their ships in an area in which they did not possess air coverage. Realizing that the battle for the Solomons was lost, the Japanese withdrew all remaining aircraft from Rabaul to Truk on 17 February 1944. Rabaul's fate was sealed, not by advancing forces in the Solomons, but by the carrier air raids of Task Force 58 on 17th and 18th February against their bastion, Truk, in the Carolines. This strike was an attempt to catch the entire combined fleet in its lair after aerial reconnaissance by 2 Marine Patrol aircraft from Marine Patrol Squadron. 254 had made the 1,000-mile flight from the Solomons and photographed the installation. Seeing these long-range aircraft, the Japanese realized what was in store for them. The combined fleet and all aircraft were sent north to save them for another day. Rabaul, the once unattainable fortress, was left to die on the vine. Just prior to the air evacuation of Rabaul, a landing was made at Green Island, north of Bougainville. When the fighter and bomber strips became operational, it provided a base just 115 miles away from Rabaul from which constant strikes could be flown. It also sealed off the northern approach to the Solomon Sea, placing the enemy forces to the south in an untenable position. Any remaining hope of relief from the north was lost with the landings on Los Negros in the Admiralties and Emerau in the St. Matthias Group on 29th February and 20th March, respectively. Thus, the strong point of Caviang on the northern tip of New Ireland was also bypassed and rendered impotent. While the Solomon Island campaign came to a close, the area still had a purpose to fill as a massive staging area for troops and supplies for the further advance towards General MacArthur's objective, the capture of the Philippines. The initial use of aircraft rockets in World War II took place in this area with torpedo bombers from Bougainville and dive bombers at Green Island using 5-inch aircraft rockets against targets in the Rabaul and Bougainville areas. An event with more potential, though, also occurred. On 27 September 1944, Special Task Air Group 1 arrived at Sterling Island, southwest of Bougainville, and Green Island with its interstate attack drones. Pilots had flown these aircraft up from the Russell Islands. Then the manual controls were neutralized and a 1,000-pound general-purpose bomb was hung under the fuselage. The aircraft were flown, under radio control from a following torpedo bomber, to targets in the Bougainville and Rabaul area. Being guided by a television camera in the nose of the drone, the controller would dive the aircraft into the target, this at a time when few had even heard of television. While the results of these strikes were inconclusive, they did prompt Tokyo Rose, the Japanese propagandist, to broadcast stories about the American suicide pilots. Kamikaze strikes were yet to be conceived by the Japanese. After expending approximately 50 drones, the squadron returned to the United States. Little did any of us who watched these strange little airplanes skitter off the deck realize we were watching the granddaddy of the formidable cruise weapons of today. As the boring days of milk runs to the bypassed Bougainville, Rabaul and Cavite bastions passed, events elsewhere brought the return to the Philippines to a reality. In preparation for the landing on Luzon and the capture of Manila, General MacArthur requested Marine dive bombers to scout the advance and protect the flanks of his attacking force. All 6 remaining dive bomber squadrons at Bougainville and Green Island were assigned this mission. Extensive training programs were established at Bougainville for the aviators, ground controllers, and the Army staff they were to work with. While deployed on Luzon, these hours of training developed a close-knit working team which finally provided the air-ground close support function marine aviation had striven for since the days in the jungles of Haiti and Nicaragua. One feature of operations of the South Pacific Forces in the Solomons was the cooperation and lack of inter-service friction between all services. No one branch could claim a major portion of the success. This was particularly evident in the operation of aircraft, Solomons, which first operated under Rear Admirals, then a Major General of the Army, and finally a Major General of Marines. The campaigns in the Solomons did not have the massive fleet and ground forces, nor the grandeur of the later Central Pacific campaigns. Yet it was in these jungles that the lessons were learned in jungle fighting and amphibious operations that made later successes possible. The offensive in the Southwest Pacific, beginning with the landings on Guadalcanal and Tulagi in August 1942, continued through 1943 as Allied strength built up. Ships, planes, troops, and bases multiplied as the front was pushed toward Rabaul. The early campaigns taught valuable lessons. Aviators gave particular attention to tactics, including ground-air liaison procedures and communications. Pre-war strategic planning had called for a naval offensive across the island groups of the Central Pacific, aimed at the Philippines and Japan. General Douglas MacArthur, Allied commander in the Southwest Pacific, felt that the main effort should, instead, continue past Rabaul and along New Guinea to the Philippines. Early in 1943, the Army and Navy laid their ideas before the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who approved a 2-prong concept. The Southwest Pacific offensive would continue, but the new Central Pacific thrust would become the main avenue of attack, while Northern Pacific forces operated against the Japanese in the Aleutians. Admiral Ernest J. King and General George C. Marshall discussed this with the British at Casablanca in January 1943, assured them that this would not drain resources needed in Europe, and won their assent. The overall strategic plan was blessed by British and American commanders in Washington in May of that year. This unprecedented campaign across thousands of miles of nearly empty ocean would have to be spearheaded and supported by a powerful force of aircraft carriers. By the end of 1942, the first of the new Essex-class fleet carriers and Independence-class small carriers were being commissioned to join Saratoga and Enterprise, the only surviving pre-war carriers in the Pacific Fleet. A number of small escort carriers, converted from merchant hulls, were in service, and a large number of purpose-built escort carriers were on their way. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of what was now called the Pacific Ocean Area, formed the Central Pacific Force in August 1943, with Admiral Raymond Spruance in command. Spruance's spearhead was the Fast Carrier Force. This was organized into task groups, each group containing 3 to 5 fast carriers, screened by fast battleships, cruisers, and destroyers to provide anti-submarine and anti-aircraft protection. The Fast Carrier Force was the fleet's long-range striking arm, designed to run interference for the fleet's amphibious force. Each landing operation would be opened by strikes at Japanese bases within flying range of the objective and on the target islands themselves. Carrier planes would support the initial landings, and the carriers would then fight off any possible Japanese counterattacks. The carrier force and amphibious force were backed up by the service force, a mobile logistic force of tenders, floating dry docks and underway replenishment ships, whose mission was to keep the fleet at sea. By 1945, the service force was even delivering replacement planes and aircrew to the carriers at sea. In mid-1943, the Joint Chiefs of Staff directed Admiral Nimitz to take the ball in the Central Pacific. Pre-war plans had looked at the Marshall Islands as the first target, but little was known in 1943 about the strength of their defences. Planners decided that the fleet was not yet up to the strength and experience needed to take on this largely unknown objective, and the first amphibious operation was aimed at the Gilbert Islands to provide bases for land-based air and vital experience for the largely untested amphibious forces. Fighter and bomber fields were built in the Ellice Islands to attack the Gilberts, and the new carriers were sent to get their feet wet by hitting Japanese island bases. Grumman's Hellcat saw its first action in a strike on Marcus Island in September 1943. Shortly afterward, a raid on the Gilberts led the Japanese to pull nearly all their planes back from the Tarawa and Makin atolls. Lifeguard submarining was tested in an air and gunfire raid on Wake Island, when Skate gave course information to incoming carrier planes and rescued 6 flyers from the water under fire. The commanding officer of the cruiser Minneapolis reported that both air power and ship-based gun power in great quantity would be needed to overcome Japanese island defenses, and even then any landing would be strongly resisted and would exact a heavy price from the attackers. He was right on both counts. The Gilbert's operation opened in mid-November 1943 as Army Liberator bombers from the Ellice attacked Tarawa. Land-based Army, Navy and Marine Corps planes continued to hit targets in the Gilberts and Marshalls as the naval task forces converged on Tarawa and Makin. The attack was led by Rear Admiral Charles Pownall's Task Force 50, 4 task groups numbering 6 fleet carriers and 5 light carriers armed with Hellcats, Dauntlesses and Avengers. The carrier Bunker Hill was introducing Curtiss Helldivers to the war. 8 Jeep carriers were assigned to support the amphibious force. One of Task Force 50's task groups launched repeated attacks on the Marshalls during the last days before the landings and helped the escort carriers cover the Gilberts, smashing 2 Japanese air attacks from Marshall Island bases. Another task group pounded Makin before and during the landing, while a third group did the same to Tarawa. The 4th task group struck the Japanese airbase on Nauru, taking it out of the Gilbert's operation, and then flew air cover for troop convoys following the invasion force. Land-based planes out of the Ellice reconnoitred the Gilberts area throughout the approach and kept up the pressure on targets in the Gilberts and Marshalls. The attack forces were aimed at the Abamama, Tarawa and Makin atolls. Abamama, nearly undefended, was captured by a raiding party. Makin was fairly easily captured by Army troops, but a submarine torpedo detonated a bomb magazine in the escort carrier Liscombe Bay, sending her to the bottom with 2/3 of her crew. A post-war account called Tarawa the Tough Nut, and indeed it was. The Japanese had constructed formidable fortifications on the island of Betio, and these were held by some 2,600 naval infantry with 1,000 construction troops. Landing beaches were shielded by coral reefs, mines and obstacles. Planners concluded that most of Betio's defences would have to be knocked out before the attack waves went in, and pinned their hopes on pre-landing airstrikes and short-range battleship and cruiser gunfire. The Navy-Marine concept of close air support got its first real test in the Gilberts. The landing force included liaison parties charged with helping the infantry commanders select suitable targets for air attack and for communicating with the supporting aircraft. Air spotting was provided by experienced pilots who had been thoroughly briefed on the ground plan. At sunrise on day 20th November 1943, carrier planes gave Betio a brief going over, followed by 2.5 hours of naval gunfire. At H-hour -5 minutes, the gunfire was supposed to lift to allow a final strafing of beach defences by carrier fighters. Innumerable complications in getting the attack waves formed and going postponed H-hour, and a communications glitch kept that word from the carriers. The strafers raked the beaches at the time appointed, but this was now 35 minutes before the new H-hour. Dense smoke over the landing area put the attack waves out of sight of bombardment ships while still 15 minutes from the beach, and most gunnery ships had to cease firing. This gave the defenders time to man their guns and reinforce the landing beaches. By the afternoon of 23 November, Tarawa was secured, but at a cost of more than 1,000 lives and 2,000 wounded. Americans were startled at the toll of this fight, for what seemed to be an insignificant speck of ground, but the capture of the Gilberts proved to be the essential first step on the ocean road to Tokyo Bay. The Navy and Marines immediately began to assess Tarawa's bitter lessons as critical reports came in from every level. Brief air and naval bombardments were not enough to defeat strongly fortified objectives. This required prolonged, carefully controlled bombing and shelling with continuing assessment of target damage. Air strikes, gunfire, and troop landings had been poorly coordinated, with fatal results. Field radios failed, and Marines ashore could hardly communicate with supporting planes and ships. High-trajectory gunfire, using heavy armor-piercing shells, was seen to be needed to penetrate major fortifications, and close-range saturation fire was judged necessary right up to the time the first waves went ashore. Though close support air sorties had produced good to excellent results, attack landing strikes were criticized. One senior aviator reported that the carrier squadrons had little concept of their mission in detail and only a rudimentary idea of how to accomplish it. The amphibious force needed a full-time air commander to help plan all aspects of air support and to control all aircraft in the landing area. Another senior air staff officer later remarked that fast carrier flyers, like Army pilots, thought in terms of air strikes and air-to-air combat. Close support missions were an irksome diversion. The escort carrier pilots, he noted, soon got in the groove and provided excellent results, and the jeeps would play an increasing role in the history of Pacific island hopping. Reports and analyses of Tarawa were carefully studied by Allied commanders planning the invasion of Europe. They concluded that air and naval fire support would have to be provided on an unheard-of scale if Hitler's Atlantic Wall was to be broken. This was carried into the plan for Operation Overlord, and it seems quite likely that the costly experience of Tarawa may have saved the lives of many Allied soldiers and sailors on the other side of the world. The attack on the Marshalls was being planned well before the Gilbert's landings. The first plan prescribed landings on the Kwajalein, Voce, and Maloelap atolls. After Tarawa, Navy and Marine Corps commanders concluded that their resources still did not permit 3 simultaneous invasions, and recommended that Maloelap and Voce first be taken and turned into bases to support an attack on Kwajalein. Admiral Nimitz caused a stir among his commanders when he opted to bypass the other atolls and take Kwajalein alone, reasoning correctly, as it proved, that the outer atolls would be more strongly defended. Admiral Spruance got authorization to occupy Majuro Atoll in the eastern Marshalls for an advanced air and fleet base. Land-based planes from the Ellice and the newly won Gilberts began the attack on the Marshalls early in January 1944. The 6 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers of the Fast Carrier Force, now called Task Force 58, under Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher, arrived on 29 January and hit Japanese airfields on Maloelap, Voce and Kwajalein, while land-based bombers struck Mili and Jaluit. On the 30th, one carrier task group destroyed Japanese aircraft on Eniwetok, while the other 3 kept Kwajalein, Voce, and Maloelap busy as the escort carriers and gunnery ships of the amphibious force joined in. Tarawa's experience had been well digested. Gunships used high and low trajectory fire with armor-piercing as well as bombardment ammunition against appropriate targets, and carrier airstrikes were carefully laid on, delivering a much greater weight of ordnance on target than had been used at Tarawa. Throughout the night of 31 January, destroyers maintained harassing fire on Kwajalein Atoll's major islands, Roy Namur and Kwajalein. Early that morning, gunfire ships closed the islands to hammer them at short ranges, while artillery landed on nearby small islands joined in. Army bombers from the Gilberts dropped heavy bombs on Kwajalein Island, and gunfire was lifted as planes from the fast carriers and jeeps bombed and strafed the beach defenses. Communications were better this time, when the Marine landing waves were delayed heading for one of the islets near Roy Namur on 31 January. Carrier planes stayed overhead and continued their attacks until the landing craft were 10 minutes from the beach. Though the relative inexperience of Marines and sailors complicated the capture of Roy Namur, The air and surface preparation worked well. Over half of the Japanese defenders were annihilated by air attack and gunfire, and most of the island's defences were put out of action. The army troops that went ashore on Kwajalein Island benefited not only from careful fire support but from months of thorough amphibious training. The landing went ashore with near-textbook precision. With the help of heavy support from carrier planes and naval guns, the soldiers cleared the island in 3 days of fighting. The capture of Kwajalein went so well that Admiral Spruance did not have to commit his reserve troops and was ready to proceed without delay to capture Eniwetok at the western end of the Marshalls Group. Japanese bases in the Marianas and on Ponape and Truk could threaten this move, but Admiral Nimitz saw how the carrier force protected the move into the Marshalls and immediately approved the Eniwetok landing. The amphibious force and a task group of Task Force 58 headed for Eniwetok as Army bombers attacked Ponape, and Admiral Mitchell took his 3 other task groups south to hit Truk. Eniwetok Atoll at the western end of the Marshalls was hit by Task Force 58 on 31 January 1944. Carrier planes worked over the airfield on Engebe Island, destroying planes on the ground and striking island defences. Airstrikes continued into day, 17th February, when escort carriers and bombardment ships joined in. Small outlying islands were taken, and Engebe itself fell the following day. Good-sized forces of crack Japanese troops were concealed on Parry and Eniwetok Islands, but these had received only a light air and naval bombardment since they were thought to be unoccupied. Documents found on Engebe revealed the truth. An impromptu bombardment assisted the landing forces, but this turned out to be insufficient. Hard fighting, helped by planes from the escort carriers, was needed before the islands were secured. Nerves were taut as the carriers approached Truk, long touted as the impregnable Gibraltar of the Pacific. They reached the launch point undetected by Japanese search planes and, as the first landings went ashore on Eniwetok on 17th February, Task Force 58's planes rained bombs and bullets on Truk's 3 airfields, destroying over 200 planes on the ground. They went on to strike warships and merchantmen in Truk Lagoon, and surface warships swept around the atoll to intercept escaping ships. During the night that followed, the carrier force made its first radar-guided night bombing attack, scoring hits and near misses on ships in the lagoon. The carrier Intrepid took a hit from a night-flying Japanese torpedo plane and had to retire for repairs. When more carrier planes came in the next morning, not a single Japanese plane took to the air. Airfield installations got a thorough going-over before Mitchell ordered his force to retire at midday. The aviators had shown Truk to be a cardboard Gibraltar. Naval ships and some 200,000 tons of cargo shipping were on the bottom. Some 270 planes were wrecked or damaged, and base facilities were hard hit. Tokyo Radio reported, "A powerful American task force suddenly and repeatedly attacked our important strategic base, Truk, with a great number of ship-based planes. The war situation has increased with unprecedented seriousness.